Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new surprise album from Taylor Swift called Folklore. I'm not going to say I called all of this, but I'm also not going to deny that as a career arc for Taylor Swift, this project was inevitable. And I'd also argue that it builds pretty effectively on what she did specifically on her last album, Lover. When I reviewed that album last year, I highlighted how much that project served as a real moment of recontextualization for her, which, yes, you would expect coming from a major shakeup in management and labels, but I'd argue the album's power came in more recentering Taylor Swift's strengths as an artist. Yes, the project is transitional and finding more of its pop sound and identity, and the missteps do come in its broadest and most anonymous moments, but it also closes doors on chasing an aspirational pop icon status that has never really fit her comfortably, and finds a lot of that emotional core of self-aware detail in her writing, while still balancing it with the hints of maturity that were starting to come through and Speak Now in the framing, but also got short-circuited by her next three albums and only really came out in pieces. And thus, it's a damn shame that Republic did not know what to do with Lover. It's become a bit of a meme in her fandom, but the singles rollout for this album was a mess and did not put her strongest cuts forward. Yes, there is an alternate timeline where Cruel Summer was the obvious lead-off single. I'd be happy to tell you about it. But I do get Republic being a little antsy and worried if Taylor Swift went full indie pop, because that's a little tougher to market. But to me, it was telling of where her interests might lie. And I remember making a prediction that if Taylor Swift stayed in pop for a while, refining her own sound and her own style, in 5 to 10 years, she'd eventually make her stripped-back singer-songwriter project, likely even going back to country to do so, when it seemed like maybe her hype was on the decline. And then all the poptimist and white boy establishment critics would come together and be united in fawning all over it as her best work to date, more on the aesthetic that they find fundamentally appealing, rather than if the writing or the production really measured up to match it. I did not expect her to release that project less than a year later after Lover. Maybe she was getting more canny and getting ahead of the curve than everybody else. Hell, maybe she was just really that bored during the quarantine and had nothing to focus on but more songwriting, or again, maybe it was just always the natural step to recruit Aaron Dessner of The National, Bon Iver, and Jack Antonoff to make her stripped-back indie pivot a reality. Well, unsurprisingly, the critics already seem to adore this album, but I will admit my expectations were a fair bit higher than they had ever been for a Taylor Swift project. I mean, you're making your obvious critic bait album, and you're looking to attract a more intense brand of scrutiny, especially to your writing. And while I can admit my own bias in the same way, hell, I've wanted the indie version of Speak Now. It's exactly the arc I've been hoping she would follow and grow and mature as an artist for years now, but I've also known she's been capable about this for, again, about the same time, and you don't just get instant cred just by finally getting there. I should also mention she chose to drop this on the same day as Courtney Marie Andrews and Laurie McKenna, who in terms of singer-songwriters are about the stiffest immediate competition that Taylor Swift has ever faced, at least from my perspective. So alright, with all that in mind, what did we get on Folklore? Well, I'll be honest. Even if I would argue that this is Taylor Swift at her most lyrically focused, Folklore on the surface didn't seem like it would give me a lot to say, where I genuinely considered putting this in On the Pulse and keeping this review pretty brief. But you know what, I might as well give it a little more space, if only because there is a lot here to talk about, and if only to address a grievance or two that will inevitably come up as Taylor Swift slides more towards indie music, but never quite establishes her own sound in the same way that she actually started to on Lover. In fact, here's a loaded hot take. As much as I think this album has some of Taylor Swift's best ever songs, I might revisit Lover more often than Folklore overall, and I still think she hasn't quite touched the heights of Speak Now. Yes, it's more even across the board than Lover was, and it doesn't have that project's dramatic lows, but that also means there are some different problems that knock it a shade back for me, in which I do think it's really damn good, and it's got some of her best ever songs, but maybe not great, at least not yet. And I do think a lot of this has to do with the sound and the production texture of this album, which if you take all the spare acoustics, the thin and often inorganic percussion, the gentle keys, and a generally rich feeling mix, they sound like a lot of softer cuts from the Nationals' I Am Easy to Find from 2019, maybe a bit of 2010's High Violet too, but minus the thick, coursing grooves that can make the Nationals so damn potent at their best. But that's the thing, Taylor Swift isn't really going for bombast or huge driving indie rock moments. For the most part, the album is soft-focused and damn near tentative in some of its soundscapes, which doesn't really align with how Taylor Swift was building more of a distinctive sound for herself on Lover that could make use of a lot of her impressive stage presence. Now, this album's production is tasteful to a fault, which I'm sure everyone who isn't immersed in indie music will find really damn pretty and unprecedented for her, but for those of us who recognize this particular palette and modern influences, it doesn't quite have that same sense of identity. Yes, she sounds fantastic opposite Justin Vernon of Bon Iver on Exile, and I can argue it's Taylor Swift's best duet that she's ever made, but let's be honest, it's Taylor Swift stepping into that folktronic shimmer rather than crafting a unique sound for herself. Frankly, I'm just surprised we didn't get that Matt Berninger collaboration, because honestly, it would have made a lot of sense. And yet, while we're on the subject of identity, let's deal with the Lana Del Rey comparison that is more flagrant than ever here, especially given that they both put out overlong, soft-focused projects produced with Jack Antonoff with a lot of cooing vocals, plenty of reverb, and both written from women who are constantly scolded for wild or compromising behavior, often unfairly, and then placed in the context of old-fashioned Americana. Now, my hot take is while there are some distinctive parallels, and Lana arguably did it first in that she's pulling from the past sound, Taylor Swift does the sound better across the board, and she has for years now, partially because she's more of an expressive singer, able to leverage her theatricality, and who doesn't immediately default to baby voice cooing, and partially because while Swift writes personal stories, she's got an eye for populism that Lana Del Rey rarely utilizes. It's also why I think Lana Del Rey's songs like Love and Video Games are her best, and that she looks outside herself and finds that connection to a larger audience. Most importantly, though, it's because while Lana Del Rey will say that she's not a feminist and primarily look backwards towards a blinkered viewpoint of femininity, Taylor Swift will take the vintage glamour from the past and then look forward to it. A positive amplification that pays tribute but doesn't succumb to nostalgia. And now that I've summed up the proxy for the tradwife discourse for the past couple of years, it's from Tumblr, don't ask, I do think it's important to highlight how Taylor Swift does have some lingering issues on this project. For one, it's not nearly as much of a surprising pivot as it's been made out to be in certain spaces, given that Taylor Swift has always had a bit of a fascination with indie music throughout the 2010s if you know where to look, especially if you read her liner notes. And there are songs pulling from a very similar playbook that she's had before, and unfortunately some structural issues with her albums that she still hasn't resolved. Her projects usually tend to run long, and while this album doesn't have the striking, out-of-nowhere low points, the length feels emphasized by the mid to low tempo presentation, and I'm not always sure she varies the sound and her delivery enough in order to keep the momentum, not helped by sequencing problems, again, that only further scatters the flow and ideas, especially on the back half. This can easily fade into the background in patches, which, I gotta say it, is not great. More notable is that if you pay attention, the cuts that are solely produced by Jack Antonoff and Taylor Swift themselves, they do feel a little bit more frail and not quite as well blended as Aaron Dessner's work, especially in some of the synthesized vocal layers. But on the flip side, Antonoff tends to give the album a little bit more sparkle and consistent foundation, so I'm just gonna wish these moments sounded a little bit better produced as a whole, maybe just touch up some of the fine details. And either way, I do wish a little bit more the percussion was more organic. Even if I find 7 a pretty inessential bit of filler, the brushes, the gentle kicks, they're a really great complement to the strings, and I wish they came through more on songs like The One instead of the sharper drum machine. I think it would match the atmosphere a little better. Hell, the fractured blend behind the thicker reverb on This Is Me Trying, it really is her making the fusion of The Archer and Back to December I did didn't know I needed, and it might be the best example of all that. Now granted, songs like The Exile and The Last Great American Dynasty, they're less obviously organic, and the latter probably has the catchiest groove and hook on the album. It should be a single soon. So there is a way to make this work, but I do wish it had come with a greater sense of warmth to the album as a whole, which probably comes through in the best in the country throwback touches of Betty, that even brought along a bit of harmonica to boot. But on the flip side, I would say the gentle chill of the spare acoustics on Illicit Affairs, it kind of nails that spare atmosphere damn near perfectly. There is a balancing point, I just wish the album felt a bit warmer and the bass lines were a little richer. But this album is going low-key and understated for a reason. The writing's taking center stage, so let's dig into it. Now, Taylor Swift has said the majority of this project is more linked to fictional imagery than a more straightforward autobiographical thematic arc, similar to what we found on Reputation or Lover. And I actually really believe that. Mostly because when Taylor Swift flexes her storytelling, she's got a great eye for some subtle, very relatable detail in order to paint the pictures of the songs. And I argue this album picks up its most power emotionally when you can tell none too subtly that she's using these quasi-fictional narratives to sift through her own feelings and reputation, where she finds a lot of that spiritual kinship with Rebecca Harkness and how she was then blamed for destroying the last great American dynasty in a similar way to how Taylor Swift has been so frequently blamed for her presumed wild behavior in her art and otherwise, which she seems to regard with wry shrugs on the surface, but you can also tell has left her a little hurt, maybe even a little broken. And this slides into her slow-burning anger of mad woman, with a well-placed critique of those who will conflate feminism with moralism, and then more than a few passing shots at Scooter Braun, probably well-deserved, and you can also see reflected on My Tears Ricochet, which I honestly kind of wish I liked a little more. It should have gone full goth, in my opinion. But then you got the subtle yearning of Mirror Ball, which also echoes The Archer and how much she will compare herself to liquid glass, fragile, beautiful, constructed as a reflection, but so easily shattered in her relationships. Even if the stories of Illicit Affairs or Exile or This Is Me Trying, even if they are completely fictional, there's enough painful reality in the subtext, the echoes of alcohol abuse, or the misspent relationships to give the songs impact. Kind of a shame the one can't really nail that echo in the same way as an odd choice for the opener, and ending on such a downbeat note of not being freed of love on a hoax feels a bit off as well. It's certainly really pretty with those padded keyboards, but its belief in a false love right after a plea for everything to work out with our current partner sincerely on peace feels a bit awkward. And while we're here, as much as I admire Taylor Swift for writing the teenage love triangle trio of songs on this album, scattering them amidst the track list while playing very coy with the details kind of mutes a bit of their impact, especially when their only thematic ties are surrounding lingering feelings of abandonment and insecurity and dealing with long-buried trauma and questions of self-image, which yes, are indeed the major through line of the album and would fit a lot of teenagers at the time. I get why the fans love them, but they don't quite assemble into a little more, even if I would argue August as a song that's great on its own. And when you tack on songs that are dreamlike moments such as Seven or Epiphany, they just don't quite hit in the same way. I'd probably include Invisible Thread in there too, even if I think the middle song there has a great vocal arrangement. Look, what I'm saying is that while the dreamy abstraction is the intent, I'm not quite sure it adds to more than the sum of the parts, especially when there are certain individual parts on this album that are more directly personal that are so damn potent. Again, some of her best ever songs. But where does that leave Folklore? Well, for one, I don't see this as a permanent change in direction for Taylor Swift. It feels like a temporary foray into uncharted territory, and I do not know if Republic will be willing to indulge this pivot that long, especially as I can tell this will be a hard sell for radio, even with Taylor Swift's name and reputation. And even with that, there's a part of me that wishes a few more of these songs had swung for the fences, with their dramatic swell and not throttled back at the last moment, as I know that both Aaron Dessner and Jack Antonoff can deliver that swell and climax in spades. And while that can come across as a bit calculated in order to preserve a more playlist-ready vibe. And even with that, I can't imagine how Taylor Swift rammed this through the focus groups. I know she probably had to fight to release this. There are also way too many scattered details that have been with her for years now for me to fully buy that this is all complete studio calculation. Like all the compositional callbacks to Imogen Heap and some of the synth layering and the vocal arrangements, or all the sprawling, languid construction. Even in the era of streaming, this might be a tough sell. Or how, again, no obvious radio hook for which she probably had to say, look, just push a few songs to radio like you did with Wildest Dreams and Delicate and pray it works. And again, to go back to where I was at the very beginning, I did have higher expectations for this, because I know when a sound is pandering to my specific sensibilities as a critic in a certain lane, and yet I can see a lot of irony in finding more isolated songs I love than the project as a whole, especially in comparison with her singles-oriented pop albums. Hell, if this project was as consistently strong as Exile, or This Is Me Trying, or The Last Great American Dynasty, or even August, this has the potential to be among the best albums of 2020. No jokes. And I gotta say it, there's a part of me that really wishes it had gotten all the way there for me. Not gonna lie, the best songs are that good. So here's what I'm gonna say. Exceedingly strong 7 out of 10, but please buy and stream this album. Because if Taylor Swift can make sounds that, like this, make them huge, make them popular, that opens so many doors for so much great music to get more attention, and that is unquestionably good. And hey, if Taylor Swift is going to keep on growing as a writer and evolving her sound, that's a net positive too. Because again, the best songs here, they're among the best of her career thus far, and I'll say it, I'm genuinely looking forward to hearing a lot more. So yeah, check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Again, I'm a little bit surprised I'm doing this as a solo review, but again, it turns out I had a lot to say. So hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below. And hey, the comments there as well. I know this album, some people might be a little critical that this is not getting the 8 out of 10 or higher, but again, this is where construction hurts her, and I really wish things had been tightened up just a little bit. That could have put this over the top. The best songs here could be among some of the best songs of 2020. Just saying it now. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process going forward, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, please don't feel any obligation to contribute. I'm doing just fine. I'm actually going to be pretty busy the next couple months. Don't worry about that. But hey, if you guys want to get involved and you have the opportunity, there you go. There you can go. But beyond that, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.